I have these memories from my childhood of renting games from Blockbuster or whatever local video store was around at the time. In a lot of these cases, the games were based on popular media, like the best TV show, movie, or kids' game show at the time. They let you be the main character, fight the main villain, and feel like you were in the game. Well, that's what they said. In reality, you were probably doing some boring task or engaged in some activity that was totally disconnected from how the show actually worked. These games were often repetitive, they had sloppy controls, even for the time, or just made you want to throw your system out the window. Today, I want to take a look at some of the biggest video games of our childhood and talk about why so many sucked so badly. And I want to start with a game that I know I rented way too many times, even though I hated it every time. Back to the Future 2 and 3. This Nintendo game was a rarity in and of itself, as it was two games in one. Well, that's how it was billed anyway. Hold that thought. In reality, this was one game with the same systems that took place in two different movies. In Part 2, you travel across the three time periods that the movie took place in and return items to their rightful periods, then destroy the infamous sports almanac that Biff used to become wealthy and alter time. In Part 3, you have to collect 10 more objects and return them to their rightful place in order to return to your Hill Valley. The game basically operated as a platformer with collection functions. Not only did you have to collect puzzle items, but you had to collect keys, fuel, and junk food, just like in the movie. This is going to be a theme throughout this video, but the biggest reason that this game was such a disappointment and so frustrating to video game fans and fans of the movie alike is that it wildly differentiated from the source material. You're not really playing as Marty McFly, you're a guy on a bunch of fetch quests. And yeah, this was the 1980s, so it was really difficult to keep a game like this tied to the source material. But was this really the best that they could do? Elevators and bottomless pits and whatever the hell this is? This is something you're going to see a lot of in this video. The branding was slapped on a platformer to make it functional and make it sell better. Need another example? Do you remember Home Alone? Well, do you remember the video game? There were actually quite a few of them, including for the Nintendo and Sega. Generally speaking, the plot was the same. You were Kevin, and you had to battle the wet bandits. That meant surviving the house or neighboring houses for a certain time period. The Nintendo games actually weren't that bad. They got the basic plot of the movie and had some relatively innovative functions like needing to hide when the bad guys showed up. It was the Super Nintendo version that always ticked me off as a kid. Which is funny because you'd think that the better gameplay mechanics and graphics of a newer system would have moved the game in a better direction. However, the Super Nintendo version lost a lot more of the plot. Instead of setting traps and hiding objects, you're taking money out of drawers, avoiding guys that look like this, and playing repetitive levels with slightly different theming. It's like the developers got lazier. Like, what's with the safe? What's with the water gun? Why are rats the main bad guy? To be fair though, at least this game holds a tangential relation to the series it's based on. You remember The Simpsons' Bart's Nightmare? I suspect that this game was responsible for more broken Super Nintendo systems than most of us would like to admit. In this 1992 game, you play as Bart Simpson, where you have to complete a series of dreams in order to recover pages of your homework. The concept itself was actually relatively new at the time. There's a core street known as Windy World, where you have to collect power-ups and hop onto a piece of paper. That paper served as the portal to one of two mini-games, and there were 8 in total. If you beat the mini-game, you collected the paper. Collect all the papers, you win. The problems with this game were multifaceted. First, the game was really hard. The controls were wonky, and most frustratingly, your success often wasn't connected to your skill level. Take the Temple of Maggie level. It's almost impossible to see where to jump, and one wrong jump without the power-up, you're dead. This game followed the trope that too many games like this fell into. It replaced creativity with difficulty in order to enhance replayability. Oh, and that says nothing about the Windy World route section of the game, where this bus should die. In 1992, Nickelodeon premiered Guts, their answer to American Gladiators. In this series, kids could play various athletic events. Most of them tested a series of athletic abilities, and points would be awarded based on how well the players did. In Season 4, the show went international, launching Global Guts, which had players from various countries compete against each other. That was actually very cool. The show went out of its way to show off the countries where the players came from. As a sheltered American, I remember finding it fascinating. It was awesome to see how other people lived. Winners of the show would receive prizes and a glowing piece of the rock, or the aggro crag, which was the main mountain you had to climb at the end of the show. Yes, you have to love a show that gives away a piece of itself as the main prize. Still better than Legends of the Hidden Temple, which gave away pieces of other shows, but anyway. Guts spawned the inevitable Nintendo tie-in. Guts for the Super Nintendo came out in 1994 and put you in the role of a player. You got to play in events, most of which were based on the actual show itself, including this bungee jump basketball thing, the obstacle course, and more. Oh, and you got to climb the aggro crag, which, again, isn't bad. I'll give this one partial credit. The controls were clunky, really clunky, but at least you could feel like you were playing in the game, which is more or less the main criteria that we use to judge these games by, right? On the other hand, the game lacked some of the most important facets, the celebrities. Guts was defined by the host, Mike O'Malley, and everyone's favorite English referee, Moira Mo Cork. Also, I said that the controls were clunky, right? And by clunky, I mean you could get lost in the obstacle course and walk into walls. The obstacle course was so bad that you actually had a timer in which to complete the course, and you probably failed more often than not. I get that this was the 1990s, but this was a little much. Honestly, even as a kid, I remember that annoying me. How hard was it to create a game where you didn't get lost playing one of the levels? Or at least, how hard was it to explain how the games work? There weren't any instructions listed. Maybe they were in the instruction manual, but honestly, who read that? Somewhat offsetting this frustration was the training mode of the game, which allowed you to practice various events. This was kind of cool if you were super competitive, or just wanted to play well enough so that you kicked the crap out of your little sister. Of course, Guts strayed way off the source material at points. Do you remember moving platforms on the show? Why do you have a health bar? Can you die? Probably not, that seems intense. Anyway, as long as we're on the subject of athletic competitions, let's talk about the roid-enhanced show American Gladiators. This TV series was a staple of the youth of countless individuals born in the 80s and 90s. In the show, you got to watch the common man or woman compete against gladiators in a variety of physical events, including pyramid, swing shot, powerball, and more. This event concluded with the Eliminator, and whoever won this challenge would ultimately win the game. There were a bunch of different versions of this game, including on the Nintendo, Genesis, and Super Nintendo. And man, did critics hate the Super Nintendo version of the game. The reason? Stop me if you've heard this one before. The damn gameplay made no sense. Multiple critics, and I absolutely remember this from my gameplay as a kid, said that playing the game was way more about a well-timed button mash than anything else. Of course, it didn't matter since you were probably going to lose. The gameplay was repetitive, smash, smash, lose. There was no practice mode, limited instruction, and barely even any reference to the actual gladiators. And to say that there was a vast difference between mini-games is an understatement. Powerball wasn't bad, it could be kind of fun, and there were ways you could actually win. Human Cannonball? I still don't understand how the controls work on that one. Thankfully, not every game was a complete miss. Remember Double Dare on Nickelodeon? I loved this show as a kid. Hell, I used to fantasize about being on it. You answered questions, took parts in physical challenges, and if you had a high score, got to run the obstacle course. This show was a kid's dream. And obviously, video game companies knew that. In 1988, developer Rare brought out Double Dare. You answered questions based on a variety of difficulty levels, and if you had the most money at the end of 2 rounds, you moved on to the obstacle course. So here's the thing. As far as video game adaptations go, this one wasn't that bad. The question format was identical to the way that the real game worked. You had multiple rounds of questions in multiple choice, and they could get broken up by a physical challenge. I'd actually argue that the physical challenges is where the game fell apart the most because the controls were so clunky and awkward. The obstacle course itself also gets high marks. In many cases, the obstacles were faithful to the real-life obstacle course, like the hamster wheel and the slime pit. Yeah, some of them were obviously made up, but this was 1988. Even the prizes were meant to mirror prizes in the real game, with the game offering up Nintendo consoles, nice promotional tie-in, TVs, and vacations if you won. Honestly, as far as video game adaptations go, this one was pretty good. But Double Dare was the exception, not the rule. In general, there were 2 sins that these video games suffered from, and a core reason about why they suffered from these issues. First, the games were often impossible. In-game instructions were limited, and in an era before the internet, you had no way, short of buying Nintendo Power and hoping they had an article, to get good at your game. This meant a lot of wasted time and frustration. But even worse was when the games didn't reflect the media that they were based on. Back to the Future and Home Alone were among the worst offenders. But among the games we didn't cover, this could be seen everywhere. Remember Lion King on the Super Nintendo? Or Aladdin? Yeah, I don't remember these scenes either. It's easy to say, hey, you're looking at these games from the perspective of 2024. They were produced in the 80s and the 90s. And that's true. To a point. Remember, a lot of these games got blasted by the critics at the time, including American Gladiators and Back to the Future. And I gotta ask, did you play any of these games as a kid? Do you remember wanting to bite your fingers off instead of playing another round? I do. And what's even more interesting is that some games, like Double Dare, absolutely got it right. Double Dare was faithful to the original material. It had the hosts, it had the players, it had all the right formatting, and it was pretty good at mapping the game's original content. Even when it added obstacles, I definitely do not remember this one, it was authentic enough. Yeah, the controls were a little clunky, but I think that's when you get into the games being an artifact of their time period. So, what's my point here? It's actually a broader one, and a much more depressing one. It is distinctly possible to draw a line between the games of today and the games of the 80s and 90s, because we all know how profit hungry many developers are. You practically can't even turn on your PS5 without having to pay a microtransaction, and companies are raking in nearly $1 billion every year on these microtransactions. Why do they push these microtransactions the way they do? Well, they want money. Duh. And that's the final point of this video. This greed that companies exhibit today, nothing new. Every single video game of our youth would have been stained with microtransactions if the technology had been available, but it wasn't. So instead, we got clunky platformers, awkward controls, and badly skinned games, all in the search of the almighty dollar.